Hi, everyone. Welcome. So, today we are going to be talking about the tax implications um, of your filing status, right? How does your taxes affect your immigration status? So, the immigration implications of your tax returns when you are filing a marriage based green card, okay? This is for if you are in the US filing for your spouse or if your spouse is outside of the US. So it is so important that you pay attention. If you have already filed your tax return or if you are still thinking about it, we are going to talk about why it's important to file your taxes, how your tax return affects your bona fide marriage finding, how your tax return affects your ability to sponsor your spouse, um, and then the mistakes to avoid, and how your tax, the tax implications of getting your green card, what you have to do tax wise once you have your green card. So, we're going to be talking about all of that. If you don't know me, I am Lillian Chukura. I am a US based immigration attorney, and I help my clients get green cards and citizenship for themselves and their families using the US immigration law system. If you have any questions as I'm going through this, please feel free to put them in the comments. If you have not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe. If you are interested in all things US based immigration, if you would like to see if we can work together and figure out if you can get your green card or citizenship, feel free to do that by going to my website, lilylegal.com, or by calling my office at 508-443-1788. Now, let's jump right in. So, when you are filing a marriage based green card application, it is very important that you file your tax return. It is very important that you file your tax returns because part of the requirement is the affidavit of support. Okay. Right now, I'm not even talking about if your income is enough. We're talking on the basic level. The affidavit of support has a requirement for tax returns. Okay. The only time you do not have to provide your tax returns is if you did not have a filing requirement. So basically, that means if the IRS says, based on your income level, based on X, Y, and Z, you do not need to file a tax return, that is the only time you do not include a tax return with the affidavit of support. So even if your income is not enough to support your spouse and you need a joint sponsor, guess what? You still have to provide your own tax returns. You still have to provide all the required documentation for an affidavit of support, even if you have a joint sponsor. So it is very important that you file your tax return, and not only that you file your tax returns, but that you file it accurately and on time. Okay. So the on time part is please file it before the tax deadline because you're most likely going to need a copy of your return. So if you're filing today and your spouse is in the US, you're going to need that for your filing. If your spouse is outside of the US and you're starting the process today, okay, maybe a year from now, you're going to need your tax returns, but you want to make sure that you're keeping up with your tax filings so that when it's time for you to provide those tax returns, you are not scrambling to basically catch up on your filing. Okay, you want to already have filed it by the tax deadline and have everything ready to go for when you need it. You don't want to be scrambling last minute looking for an accountant or, is H&R Block open off season? Remember, season for tax people is between January and April and then around October. So make sure that you have your tax things in order before you even start the process. Because if your spouse is in the US, like I said, you cannot even do the process without your tax return. Okay? Because USCIS needs to make sure that your affidavit of support is good before they start processing your application. So it is so important. Now, as far as filing it accurately, that takes me to the next thing of how your tax return can be evidence for bona fide marriage. Okay, when you are filing green card based on marriage, there is a requirement that you show that your marriage is real, that you are presenting yourself as a married couple, right? So if you are presenting yourself as a married couple, it will go to show that your tax returns is also is one of the actually your tax return is one of the ways that you are telling the government every single year your marital status, right? So if your tax return says single but you're married, that doesn't look good for your bona fide marriage. Okay, so basic taxes. And before I even get into this, let me make sure it's clear. I am not a CPA. I am talking about the immigration implications of your tax return. I'm not telling you what filing status to do. Please talk to a CPA, please talk to an enrolled agent about your specific situation and see what tax status makes sense for you. But I will tell you that for married couples that are telling the US government, telling USCIS that we are in a marital relationship, we live in the same household, the only filing status that should be available to you is married filing jointly or married filing separately. That's it. Okay. If you file head of household, the only most of the time the only way for a married person to file head of household is if they did not live with their spouse for the last 6 months of the year. So if you are filing head of household and you live with your spouse, then you are confusing USCIS, right? Because now they have to question, is she lying to us by saying that she lived with her husband, or is she lying to the IRS by saying that she didn't live with her husband, right? So that becomes an issue that you do not even want to deal with. Okay. You want to have your tax situation not be the thing that raises eyebrows about your case. Okay. So if you are married and you live with your spouse, your marital status should only be married filing jointly or married filing separately. And if you're married filing separately, please, please, please have a good reason for it. Okay. So most of the time, people that file separately, it's because, the husband or the wife has a tax obligation, right? They may have child support obligations, which means once they file their tax returns, whatever refund they have will be taken automatically for that tax obligation, for that child support obligation. And the spouse that does not have the tax obligation or the child support obligation does not want their refund going towards that. So they will go ahead and file separately so that they can get their refund. And then the other spouse that has the obligations, their refund can go towards the tax obligations and the child support obligation. Okay. So those are really the only time I advise people to file separately when they have a case pending or if they're planning on filing. Okay. Because you don't want your taxes to be the thing that makes the officer question your relationship. Okay. So filing head of household. First off, you need a qualifying relative to file head of household. Your spouse, even if they are not working, even if your spouse is not working and they live with you, you are still not allowed to file head of household. Talk to your CPA, please. Give them the full picture of your relationship, of the fact that you live together, and they will tell you you cannot file as head of household if you lived in the same household with your spouse for the last 6 months of the year, right? At any point in the last 6 months of the year. Not, oh, we only live together for 1 month. No, the last 6 months of the year, you did not live with your spouse at all. That's when you may file head of household. But then that raises questions for USCIS, especially if your spouse lives in the US, because you're saying we do not live together by filing head of household. Just saying. So that's one thing. That's one way it will affect the bona fide marriage. We got married, we are presenting ourselves as married, but you're filing head of household, which contradicts your whole we live together. Okay. So what I just talked about is for people that live in the US with their spouse and are filing for green cards in the US. Now, if your spouse lives outside of the US, you still have the option. You still have the option of married filing jointly, married filing separately. You could file head of household if you have a qualifying relative. Because remember, I said if you did not live with your spouse for the last 6 months of the year, you may have the option to file head of household if you have a qualifying relative, right? But in order to file married filing jointly, your spouse needs a tax ID number. So this is where people get confused, right? You can file married filing jointly with a spouse that does not live in the US, but your spouse needs a tax ID number. So you have to request a tax ID number for your spouse that does not live in the US, does not have any US income. But just know, if you're filing jointly, and your spouse is getting an ITIN, their income, wherever they are in the world, their income can be taxed by the US if you file married filing jointly. So that's one of the reasons people don't do that, especially if their spouse is a high income earner. Now, if your spouse is not working at all, then that may be a good option because you get the best tax benefits as a US person, right? You'll get the married filing jointly deductions, and you're basically in your spouse's income, because your spouse doesn't have an income, is not being taxed in the US. But if your spouse does have an income, it will be taxed in the US as well. So just keep that in mind. You also have the option of filing married filing separately. For this, you don't need an ITIN. Okay. If your spouse is not in the US, you do not need an ITIN to file married filing separately. You can do that without an ITIN. So keep that in mind. Those are, you could file head of household if you have a qualifying relative. So let's say you live in the US, you have children, and your spouse is not in the US. You are still able to file head of household because you have a qualifying relative, your children, and you did not live with your spouse for the last 6 months of the year. Okay, so those are the requirements. So you have those options available to you. Single, I do not like that, right? As an immigration lawyer, your tax person may say that single is fine, right? So for tax purposes, that may be fine. Again, talk to your CPA, talk to your enrolled agent, talk to your tax professional. But as an immigration lawyer, that's not something I like, because it's not helpful to you, right? And it may even raise questions. However, I have to, say that, however, I have not seen USCIS or embassies have an issue with my clients filing single because of the fact that the spouse does not live in the US, right? So I have not had that issue, but to avoid the issue, I typically ask people to file Married filing jointly, married filing separately, head of household if they qualify. But single is something that a married person filing a green card application for their spouse should not be doing. Okay. And I've seen people in the US living with their spouse file single. I'm like, but that doesn't help you, right? It doesn't help you tax wise because you're going to pay more taxes. And the only difference is, and they always tell me, oh, well, my spouse doesn't want to get an ITIN. Okay. Then file separately without an ITIN because they wouldn't qualify for head of household because they live with their spouse. But it's so important that you're paying attention to these little things. It may seem, oh, well, who's actually looking at my tax returns? USCIS is, right? The embassy is, because it's part of the requirements. And I just want people to understand this. Every time you file for your spouse, affidavit of support must follow it. And what has to follow the affidavit of support? Your tax returns. So they are looking at it. I'm telling you right now, for USCIS, when you're filing a one step, so you're filing the I-130 and the I-485 together, the affidavit of support automatically goes with that. In order for them to work on your work authorization, if you filed it at the same time, they have to sign off on your affidavit of support first. So before they even start looking at your work authorization, whether they can approve it or not, they're first looking at whether you qualify, whether your affidavit of support is enough. And if it's not enough, they move on and ask you for more documentation or for a joint sponsor. So it's not whether they're going to look at it, is they are going to look at it. And the question is the officer going to look at the filing status and have an issue with it? And you don't want your filing status to be the thing that basically sets off red flags everywhere for the officer. Okay. So do that. The next thing is the income requirement, right? USCIS, they will tell you, oh, well, your affidavit of support is based on your current income. Well, your affidavit of support is based on your current income, but they look at your tax returns, your prior year tax return, to see if you're actually earning at that level. So if you're still at the same job and you say you're making $50,000 a year, but your prior year tax return shows that you worked the same amount of hours, but you only made like 15,000. That's going to be a question of, okay, we need more documentation of your income, right? Or you may need a joint sponsor. So it's really important that your tax return reflects your accurate income. And then secondly, if you are self-employed, my self-employed people, I'm with you, come here, let's talk. If you are self-employed, they are not looking at your Schedule C. Okay, USCIS does not care about your Schedule C. They care about your adjusted gross income and your total income. So they're only looking at the form 1040. So your Schedule C that says that you made 100,000, but then you got all these business deductions, and then it ended up being like zero income on your actual 1040. Yeah, that's not gonna fly. That is not going to fly. So talk to your accountant, make sure that your tax return is reflecting your income. Okay, make sure your tax return is reflecting your income, or that you have assets to offset the income. All right, so self-employed, USCIS does not care about your Schedule C. They care about your total income and adjusted gross income on your 1040. So if you are self-employed, pay attention to Form 1040 for that total income. If you are, if you're claiming expenses that you don't actually have and you're, inflating stuff, it may be time to stop doing that if you're planning on filing for your spouse, because again, you want to have an accurate return. You want to have your your profit and loss statement for the year. So basically, if you have a tax return from 2022 and they want to know, okay, what's your current income, you're going to need a profit and loss statement. You're going to need bank statements. You're going to need a statement from your accountant. You need documentation to show your self employment income. It's more documentation than if you had a W 2 job. That's just what it is. But if you are self-employed and you pay yourself on a W-2, so let's say you're a C corp or an S corp, you're getting a W-2. So your W-2 will be able to show your income. So then you don't need to worry about any Schedule Cs because, again, your company is filing its own tax return. You're getting your W-2. You're good. So it's basically the same as if you were just an employee. So pay attention to that if you're self-employed. All right. And then mistakes to avoid. I already touched on some of this, right? I already touched on some of these mistakes. Do not file in the wrong tax filing status. Okay. The wrong filing status can affect your case, especially if your spouse is in the U.S. If your spouse is not in the U.S., it's a different situation. They're more lenient on that. But if your spouse is in the U.S. living with you, there's no reason for your tax return to say single or for your tax return to say head of household. You really only have two options, and that is married filing jointly or married filing separately. If you are married filing separately and your spouse is not in the US, remember, you don't need an ITIN. But if you want to file jointly and your spouse is not in the US, you will need an ITIN. So it is so important that you pay attention to your filing status and not make those mistakes. Do not claim deductions that you do not actually need or qualify for. So sometimes people will claim their, their nieces, their nephews as part of their tax return. Guess what? Sometimes USCIS will count those people that you're claiming as a dependent on your tax return as part of your household. And if they put them as part of your household and they're not actually part of your household, that's going to mean that the income you need to make is going to be more. So let's say on your tax return, you're claiming 4 people, right? 4 nieces and nephews as your dependent. And USCIS counts all those 4 people as part of your household. Now, you need income for a 6-person household, right? So yourself, your spouse, and the 4 people that you're claiming. Now, that's a lot of money that you need to make versus if you're just claiming yourself and then your spouse. If it's just the 2 of you, it's going to be less income than if it was the 6 of you. So pay attention to who you're claiming and make sure they're actually part of your household. So do not make that mistake, please. Please, please, please. Report all your income. Again, it will help you when you go to do the affidavit of support because, again, the more income you have, the easier it is for you to qualify to sponsor your spouse. All right. And this goes for, the affidavit of support portion of this goes for all anyone that's filing for family. You need to make sure that your tax return reflects your income accurately so that you qualify to be a sponsor. All right. USCIS really cares about your income on your tax return on the 1040. All right. If you are self-employed, like I said, avoid claiming deductions or expenses that you do not qualify for, or inflating right? That's the other thing. Sometimes you inflate your expenses so that you pay less taxes. However, that means you make less money, right? On the 1040, it shows less income, which means you're going to most likely need a joint sponsor if you do not make enough, or you would need to show, you will need to show assets that make up for that. Another thing to avoid if you are self employed is not having your tax your financial house in order, right? If you're self-employed and you're going to be filing for a spouse, just know just know you're going to need profit and loss statements. You're going to need your bank statements. You're going to need a letter from your tax person. So that may be a CPA, a tax attorney, anything like that will need to be on their letterhead, basically saying, yes, I certify that this is their profit and loss year to date. Okay, so it's really important that you have your finances in order as a self-employed person. If you're a W-2 employee, you don't have to worry about that because you get your pay stubs and that's proof of your income. All right. I just want to make sure that I covered everything. And then once you become a green card holder, just know, right, once your spouse files for you, you get your green card. Please make sure you're also filing your taxes. I believe I talked about this in my last video, but I just want to touch on it again. File your taxes as a green card because if you want to be a citizen and you haven't filed your taxes, that's going to affect whether you can become a citizen or not, because that's one of your responsibilities is to make sure that you're filing your taxes. All right. And then as far as the filing status, I just want to flag also, this goes for if you're, if this is your initial filing or if you're filing to remove conditions. So if you have a 2-year green card, just know in those 2 years, you should still be paying attention to your filing status and making sure you're filing accurate tax returns. All right. This is not just for that initial application. You get your 2-year green card and then you're like, okay, now I can file head of household. No, because you still have to remove the condition, and the office is going to be looking at those and just be like, how are you filing head of household? That means you and your spouse were not living together, right? You got your green card and now you and your spouse are not living together and you want us to approve your 10-year green card. No, we're not going to do that. So it's really important that your filing status matches your actual real life situation. So important. So important. But yeah, that is all I have for you. Just a quick run through again. It's important that you file your taxes accurately and on time, right? Your tax returns can be evidence of your bona fide marriage, proven to USCIS and the embassy that your marriage is real. You need to meet your income requirements. So your tax returns is a great way of showing that you meet that income requirement. If you are self-employed, just know they are looking at your 1040 and not your Schedule C. Okay, they do not care about the amount on your Schedule C. They only care about the 1040, and you need to have your profit and loss statements ready to go. All right. Once you get your green card, please, please, please do file your tax returns. Do not claim any income or any deductions, dependents that are not real, because that can affect how much money you need to make in order to sponsor your spouse. All right. So, as always, if you have questions, put them in the comments. I am more than happy to respond to them. If you have any personal questions that you want to ask me, feel free to go to my website, lilylegal.com, or call my office at 508-443-1788, and we can talk about your specific immigration situation and see how, if your questions about taxes, how that can affect your particular green card application or your ability to file for a green card in the future. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining me. And as always, I am Lillian Chukura. I am the attorney and owner of Lily Legal, where we do immigration law and we do